how would you define a Souls-like? What makes FromSoftware games so special? And what's up with these strings on me? Let's talk about it.
Oh, yes. Pale blood. Well, you've come to the right place.
These are the first words you hear when you begin a new game in FromSoftware's Bloodborne. No backstory, no context, no explanation. Only the quiet horror of waking up supine in a stretcher, at the mercy of a strange, emaciated old man. His only comforting words that you are in the home of Blood Administration, the city of Yharnam, and that you'll join the hunt to unravel the mystery.
Ah, you found yourself a hunter.
After traversing through the dark and dank room of Yusefka's clinic, now empty, save for the splatterings of wet and dried blood, you reach the doorway to its entrance. In the courtyard sit the decaying headstones, groups of buried bodies cluttered in circles along cracked pathways, a normalcy in a town littered with the dead. You exit, after slowly opening iron gates, and gaze upon an impossible red and orange sky. This is Central Yharnam. This is Bloodborne. Not an adventure or a mystery, but a descent, where truth and unearthed history lead only down into the corners of madness, horror, and the unknown of the cosmos. Last year, South Korean developers NeoWiz Games and Round 8 Studio released Lies of P, an action RPG that took heavy inspiration from the games of FromSoftware, but based on the children's fantasy book of The Adventures of Pinocchio. On paper, a Souls-like game with a puppet protagonist from a kid's story seemed like a bad match. But upon glance, Lies of P looked like it had all the visual markings of a FromSoftware game. At times, almost one-to-one. The city of Krat looked damp and broken, combat seemed difficult, with menacing enemies and visceral weapon attacks. There was a flask mechanic, huge and strange bosses, a bonfire, a level-up system through a developing relationship through a heartwarming woman. You get the idea. Everything we've come to expect from a FromSoftware game was present, only now it existed in a world overrun by crazed puppets. The FromSoft influence wasn't just worn on the sleeves of Lies of P, it was the entire outfit. And with so many other Souls-like games from other developers on the market, with none of them, in my opinion, ever truly hitting close to what makes FromSoftware games so special, I was skeptical about another copycat. But after release, and into Game of the Year 2023 discussions, I kept seeing Lies of P return again and again from critics I admire. They lauded the game as the definitive Souls-like experience outside FromSoftware, the closest thing to a Souls game we could get, and then some. My interest was piqued, but still, I couldn't help but ask, was it really true? Was Lies of P finally a proper Souls-like? And what do we mean by Souls-like, anyway? Is it just difficulty? By that logic, could you maybe then say games like Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown are borrowing Souls-like elements to create difficult combat encounters in a Metroidvania? Was Lies of P then just full of difficult combat encounters that looked and sounded like Bloodborne? Was there any of the narrative intrigue, the lore, the mystery, the clandestine madness, the descent? I had to find out. I needed to know if there was another studio that could dig its heels into those implicit elements beyond what we associate with the definitions of Souls-like. Those amorphous sentiments that resonate in between the ever-increasing but oh-so-surmountable clashes of steel and flesh that line the foundation of Souls games. Or was it all just my ego that was in the way? Were the strings actually on me, waiting to be cut? Welcome home, good hunter, to the hunter's dream, to the lands of Ashina, to the lands between, to the real world, to another video. Welcome to Save Room. Okay, as always, we have to establish a few parameters of what a Soulslike actually is in order to suss out if Lies of P actually succeeds in trying to be one. Sleuthing through articles online, you'll run into the same 3 core elements that commonly define a Soulslike: hard difficulty, exploration through level design, and, of course, lore. All of these definitions, while certainly true, are unfortunately only part of it. They are observations existing on the surface level, with the actual heart of the Souls definition existing in the hidden implications from each of these elements. So, in order to better understand each of these parts, we'll have to go through them one by one, keeping FromSoftware games in conversation with Lies of P all the while. Combat is perhaps the most easily identifiable element when we consider Souls definitions, as Souls-like games rely most on player interactions with systems and mechanics. From weapon types and build varieties, strategically placed but challenging enemies that serve both as combat tutorials and skill checks, and incremental improvement through RPG elements and permanent upgrades. Over the years, however, FromSoftware has refined many of the little things that, when taken together, make up much of what we consider the Combat Souls formula. Armored Core 6, while still primarily a mech action game, took heavy inspiration from FromSoftware's recent lineage of titles in order to evolve and somewhat modernize its approach to combat. VaatiVidya, one of the most prolific FromSoftware YouTubers, details many of these minute elements that make up Souls combat in his video, I Played Armored Core 6. Let's hear what he has to say and make note on the additional details.
It's also the first Armored Core to have a lot of things in common with Souls. For example, Armored Core 6 now has a completely decoupled camera. Your mech has fast turning speeds. You can heal. There are checkpoints. Bosses have heavily telegraphed attacks. There's a visual stagger system, a timed block system, and a hard lock as well.
And it's true. From Dark Souls 1 into Bloodborne and Sekiro, and all the way through Elden Ring and now AC6, Souls games have explicitly used a majority of these elements to define their combat. But just because these elements are present, doesn't mean a game's identity is compromised. Sekiro's fast action, deflect-focused combat feels unique against a more methodical Dark Souls 3, and even still sets itself apart from the aggression-rewarding Bloodborne. Simply, FromSoftware's combat is the foundation, but never the branch a game will grow as a whole. Each title can still set itself apart. But, more importantly, as with any element of game design, it's the intention from the developers that makes up the definition. After all, what is the point of combat? Implicit in the definition of Souls-like difficulty is the intention found beyond the controller. What we feel when we play a Souls game. Never throughout the campaign of a FromSoftware title is the combat about the difficulty itself. Rather, the feeling you get against overcoming increasingly difficult foes by engaging with established mechanics. And I'm not even specifically talking about those moments of elation when downing a difficult boss either, though those moments are important, but how the mind and spirit adapts over time to facing those hard enemies. FromSoftware titles reward patience and self-reflection at every moment, including in combat. Learn when to block, how to parry, when to dodge, and when to attack. Learn the rhythm over and over and over again. Sometimes, dying is part of that process. How you respond in those moments is where the defining essence of Souls-like combat exists. Pay attention, and you'll realize that once difficult skill check enemies become easier to best the later in the game you progress. Confidence in your abilities is instilled over time. It's you that's gotten better, and not necessarily your stats. And even though this notion is easier said than done, Souls-like mastery is not ever truly insurmountable. You just have to spend the time engaging with the defining mechanics. Thus, the defining nature of a Souls game's combat doesn't end with difficulty, it's where it begins. So, how does this get us to Lies of P? Based on our definition so far, is Lies of P a Souls-like? Well, it's complicated. There's another video that exists on this channel from our video lead, Peter Hunt-Spatek, titled, Lies of P is Overdesigned. While I don't agree with every criticism Peter has with Lies of P systems and mechanics, sorry Peter, there is a core thesis that we can apply to the definitions of Souls-like combat.
I think it's clear how heavily inspired it is by FromSoftware's catalog of games. However, it borrows too many ideas from the entire catalog, when I think a more refined approach to its mechanics might have resulted in a more focused experience.
Let's unpack this a little bit. Bloodborne shook up the Souls combat formula when it released back in 2015 by introducing the rally system. When you take a hit in Bloodborne, you'll notice a faded slider to the right of your current available health. Since Estus flasks were now replaced with blood vials, and were not a refillable quantity but instead an inventoried item, rallying back lost HP by counterattacking enemies worked to establish a new combat flow in a Souls game. Bloodborne rewarded more aggression, remaining up close in battles to regain lost health. This meant that the best defense was to effectively utilize iframes with timed dodges to evade enemy attacks while still remaining up close, literally leaning into attacks, no matter how scary they looked. What made this system better was the possibility of regaining lost HP through the rally system even after and through an enemy's death animation. 4 years later, Sekiro shook our presupposed definitions of Souls combat once again through fundamentally changing the combat systems while still retaining difficulty and rewarding player aggression. Sekiro's combat built itself around its defensive mechanics. In order to best many of the difficult enemies in Ashina, you had to rely on effectively blocking, deflecting, and focusing chipping away at an enemy's posture meter while minimizing the incoming damage to your own. Suddenly, the strategy we had learned across several titles beforehand of finding openings to inflict heavy attacks had now fundamentally changed. A new combat flow was born. We're no longer looking to deal as much damage to health as possible. We're looking at inflicting damage to posture through defensive mechanics to perform finishing blows. Thus, the difficulty came with relearning Souls combat and adapting to an even faster paced rhythm. We had to lock the fuck in. The way this type of combat was elevated was through the 3 perilous attacks enemies could deal, each of which could be countered in some way by paying attention to both the kanji displayed at the beginning of the move and the body language of the enemy. Thrust attacks could be countered by using the Makiri counter, dodging into an enemy's thrust to counterattack and deal massive posture damage. Sweep attacks could be countered by jumping over an enemy to dodge, or downward kicking from above to counter for, again, more posture damage. And lastly, grab attacks could be countered by either dodging to the side or jumping over, each of which opened the enemy up for dealing posture damage yet again. And of course, the introduction of the wolf's prosthetic arm as an additional tool to use against enemies allowed for varied approaches to combat, with many tools available to counter foes you'll face through Ashina. Both of these took radical approaches to their gameplay while still retaining the core elements of what defines a Souls game. The key distinction is that both titles separately leaned into their new mechanics to establish their own identity within Souls. Same foundation, different branch. Lies of P is at its best when we're forced to engage with its own additions to Souls mechanics. In attempting to establish its own style of player combat aggression, having to perfect guard in order to break down enemies' weapons, and stunning them to open up for heavy attacks, works to position itself as a proper Souls-like. Even more new and interesting is the addition of Fable Arts, building up a blue Fable meter by either attacking or deflecting incoming attacks, and then using one of the several unique arts attached to your equipped weapon. consuming some of the meter until built up again for another use. This sets itself apart from the Ashes of War in Elden Ring, wherein instead of upgrading a mana meter through investing points on a stats board, the use and refill of the gauge comes from the more one engages with the core gameplay. And similar to the prosthetic arm in Sekiro, the Legion arm in Lies of P works to vary approaches to combat from both offensive and defensive fronts. Where Lies of P stumbles is the degree to how much it's stuck trying to be too much like the games it's inspired by and borrowing from. While I like that the rally system was expanded beyond the player and onto enemies, once again leaning into the notion of player aggression, the reliance of Sekiro-style pairing as the primary means of engaging with more difficult enemies felt disjointed in the grand scheme of its design. While it certainly sucks that you can't regain HP through death animation in Lies of P, the rally system in general has implications of a more aggressive, offense-based playstyle, of dodging into attacks to leverage iframes and sneaking in hits during enemy openings. But many enemies and bosses necessitated a defensive approach, relying on either blocking or parrying attacks to create openings. The issue here is twofold. Blocking will eat away at P's health, with the player unable to rally back some of the lost HP while having to focus on defensive strategies. And 2, there is no visual representation of an enemy's stagger meter through parrying, with players needing to guess if they are close to either breaking an enemy's weapon or their posture. And with both the timing of dodge windows and parry windows less than ideal, you're left with a game that has abandoned its strengths in favor of disconnected combat that leaves itself in a bit of an identity crisis. And yeah, of course mastering both dodging and parrying isn't an easy task. Like any other Souls game, learning a combat flow takes patience and time. But I'm also not convinced a skill issue is the one to blame here, with NeoWiz incorporating patches directly addressing issues with combat by adjusting the speed of incoming attacks for better readability, and even adjusting the dodge/parry window after fan feedback after the release of the demo. But the issues still linger. Lies of P houses a parry window that's tighter than Sekiro in a defensive game that deceptively functions like the offensive Bloodborne. And don't get me wrong, those feelings of elation at downing a tough boss and the reward of self-improvement is still present. It's just cheapened frequently by forgetting to shape its own identity. In trying to be as Souls-like as it could get, Lies of P loses itself in its own disconnect. Only when it remembers to be more of itself in the element of combat and its established core mechanics does it truly stand as a good Souls-like. And it's just that most of the time, it's not really doing that. Remember Elden Ring? Remember losing yourself in that world? The profundity found in that game is something I'll never forget. There are a handful of locations and events in Elden Ring that have resonated with me more than I ever could have expected, each more formative than the last. Of course, like many players, discovering the vastness of the lands between was a defining moment. For some, it was walking out onto the cliffs above Liurnia of the Lakes from Stormvale Castle. For me, it was opening a chest that transported me back into the hellish rocks of Caelid and seeing the apocalyptic red sky, and really feeling a guttural fear and uneasiness at beholding a sight I don't think I should have seen, wandering helplessly toward any site of grace I could find. The other moment was found in East Limgrave, where in a secluded well along the dense forest, housed what looked like your typical FromSoftware elevator platform. I boarded the elevator, expecting it to take me a few feet below. Except, it kept going, rushing further and further, and still somehow further down deep into the underground, an entire world below the surface. I trembled in that darkness until I found myself staring at a cavernous ceiling painted with rocks and minerals that resembled the cosmos themselves. I found myself at the foot of what was eventually the beginning of a search for the Eternal City. But the most important of these moments came hours and hours later. One that shook me to my core the further I ventured forward into those insidious depths, into the secrets below Leyndell. In the middle of the capital city, there's another well, one that you can climb down into with a small ladder. At first, there isn't much below the surface. A couple of corridors and the ankle-deep still water soaking your feet. And then you go down, past a long hallway, and down slightly once more. A hint of green encompasses the darkness ahead as rats and decay begin to fill the sewers. Until one small door. It's here you enter the subterranean shunning grounds. A labyrinth of sewage pipes with only a few stabs of light from above and the ruins of tattered cloth hanging on the rope lines. Life was once here. In the maze of pipes are the numerous dead ends with deceptive finality to the area. It isn't. Somehow, you keep going down. At one end is a large room with piled corpses and a steady flow of fecal water. Tucked in the corner is a broken wall leading into the Leyndell catacombs. And another end waits the loathsome dung-eater, steadily beating his head against a bloodied wall, going mad in his decrepit jail. At the third end lies still another hole. Somehow, you go down again. Spiral stairs take you further and further below, looping underneath to another level of maze-like sewer pipes. And yet, still, eventually, another elevator. Stepping into the cage propels you down hundreds of feet into the forsaken depths. Finally, a boss fight. After hours of fumbling through the cesspool of sewage in the depths of the capital, you're ready to emerge back onto the surface. No. And then... For what should be an impossibility, you find a secret passage that takes you down even deeper, beyond what should be structurally possible. In the Cathedral of the Forsaken sit the countless bodies of merchants forcibly sealed below the capital, left to succumb to twisting insanity and the disease, left to starve amongst themselves, and left to rot. In the insidious depths of surreptitious history is the path to chaos and the frenzied flame. Why bring this up? Why go through the trouble of detailing so much of just one side area most players won't even see? Well, that's sort of the point. FromSoftware's approach to storytelling is one heavily rooted in exploration. There's a marriage between their game's setting and its lore. Implicit in our definitions of Souls exploration is this coming together of level and narrative design, usually through the exploration of a dilapidated environment. And I'm not even talking the occasional poisonous swamp. And implicit in lore are these routine rug pulls, where uncovering truths lead further and further toward insidious secrets and dark history of the world, one the player has to seek out. Even the linear FromSoftware games have this sort of side activity unlocked through close attention to the world you're interacting with. Bloodborne has Cainhurst Castle and the amygdala after gaining enough insight. Dark Souls 1 has the painted world of Ariamis, and Dark Souls 3 has Archdragon Peak. And every time you encounter one of these clandestine areas, the identity of the game grows deeper. This level of craft are the true implicit definitions of a Souls game. Hidden exploration of a dilapidated setting and routinely uncovering deeper, insidious lore. For me, Lies of P fails in this regard, even if there's an earnest attempt being made. Through its linearity, there are seldom areas for us to explore throughout Krat, save for a few quests toward the latter half of the game. And while some of these are a bit more involved, they never quite reach the level of depth FromSoftware is able to achieve through their level design. There is no Lies of P equivalent of a Cainhurst Castle or a painted world to be found in Krat. I think the heart of the issue in Lies of P lies with the fact that much of the lore presents itself explicitly through the main path of the game. It's hard to feel like you're uncovering the locked secrets of Krat when mysteries are told to us in real time, rather than shown through our own individual exploration of the environment. In Lies of P, we're told explicitly that settings are creepy, but not made to ever feel it. We're told the history of the petrification disease, but we never feel like we discover it on our own. And we're told the premise of the game's setting rather than thrust into the world for us to slowly piece together. Even Elden Ring's opening, which features voiceover, vaguely details the veil of political turmoil from a generation ago. Lies of P, conversely, details explicitly the crux of the fallout of Krat in the span of just a few minutes. There's less left to the imagination. There are major reveals throughout the game, sure, but even its most important mechanic, lying, doesn't really succeed in leveraging it for any conversations or activity. The events that transpire in the game are an indirect result of cumulative action over time, and not a direct result of individual moments. In a game that revolves around the dichotomy of either truth-telling or lying, there's no direct result for each individual response P gives, only whether or not you've accumulated enough humanity to alter the climax. This means that when you do eventually meet side NPCs that should offer those rug pull moments of mystery, lore, and insidious secrets, the responses we're given are ultimately somewhat of a farce. It doesn't matter how P responds to the biggest question the game seeks to ask, one that should inform the overall storytelling if you've already told enough small lies to feel human warmth by the time the question is even asked. Once again, there's another disconnect between the version the game wants to be and the game it actually is. So, when much of our Souls-like definitions hang on this sort of deep exploration and subtle presentation of lore, Lies of P falls just short of being the true Souls-like game it seeks to be. Simply, it's punching above its weight with arms too short to reach. On the surface, Lies of P looks like it fills each of the requisites for Souls-like definitions. It looks and deceptively feels like a game we're already familiar with. But past the surface, there simply isn't much depth to sink into. After hours of wanting the game to be better than it was in each of these categories, I just couldn't call it a true Souls-like. And then I realized there's actually one more definition not a lot of people talk about. Something more important than difficulty or lore. Something I felt in me. After a few hours spent with the game, after confronting a woman in a window, tasking me with a fetch quest in the streets of Krat, and then telling my first real lie, I received a small reward, the record, and it single-handedly changed my perspective of the game. Interspersed throughout any Souls game are these small individual moments of quiet catharsis in the aftermath of battle. Whether it's a bonfire, a lamp, a sculptor's idol, or a site of grace, players will sit unbending by the warmth. Literally a moment's peace. Every element of Souls-like games culminate in these moments spread throughout any individual journey. Moments of self-reflection, soft meditation, quiet beauty. And without moments like this, I'm not sure if Souls games would have remotely the same kind of impact. We need the light with the dark. After returning to Hotel Krat, I walked over to the gramophone and opened up the sleeve for the singular record in my collection. The world went quiet, with only the dull hum of the hotel air filling the space. Feel began to play.
Close your eyes.
For the next 3 minutes and 55 seconds, I sat unmoving, watching the digital record spin against the tone arm. And I thought, fuck, is everything I thought about this game wrong? I might be. For those 4 brief minutes, I felt closer to the warmth of bonfires than I ever did before in any Souls game. I sat, gazing as if it were me looking into the embers of fire, lamps, or light. I gave myself over completely to that melodic melancholia. And for that brief moment, it was beautiful.
You make me feel alright.
the end of the 4 minutes, P gained humanity, simply for standing there and listening to the music I played from the record. I felt my springs moving. And it was with these records that I realized how important the system of humanity in this game actually is, and how even acquiring the record in the first place required a moment of empathy toward a woman I didn't even know, even if I had to tell a white lie to get there. And this feeling lingered, not just after the record ended, but through the rest of the game. Every time I returned to the hotel, I'd spin my growing collection of records. I'd walk around and soak in the warmth of growing camaraderie in the lobby. I'd try to pet the cat. And everything I did in the game after, no matter how difficult or how annoying, or whatever thought I had about my previous analyses, it'd always go back to that same damn music. I know it's a bit heady and poetic to say that the most important element of Souls-like definitions is this amorphous notion of growing humanity, but really, it's true. The best ending of Dark Souls 3 is putting an end to the current age as we know it for the chance of a new age to spring forward out of the ashes, a chance for humanity to prosper. And these stories of finding and lifting humanity really are found in all our beloved FromSoftware games. And suddenly, it made sense why NeoWiz and Round 8 would foreground the element of humanity so explicitly and turn it into a system that defined the game. Because it's important. Frequently, repeatedly, over and over again, I found myself at the end of those 4 minutes of the record. Like a Souls character, I'd sit and stare, sit and think. Only this time, I was now thinking about my assertions about Souls-like definitions. At the end of those 4 minutes, I realized maybe it doesn't really matter if the lore isn't mysterious enough. At the end of those 4 minutes, I thought, yeah, maybe it's okay if their first Souls-like game isn't perfect systemically and mechanically. Because is any game, let alone the FromSoftware games I love so much? At the end of those 4 minutes, I realized what mattered. That the most important element of a Souls game was on full display and made into a tune I could play and replay and still walk away with the same feelings I felt when I first spun the record. That maybe it's the quiet beauty that matters most above everything else. That maybe, just maybe, Lies of P really is the Souls-like it aims to be. Just not in the way I expected. It cut its strings for something more empathetic. It found its humanity. Like and subscribe.